If you were to drift through the labyrinthine corridors of Olympus late at night, you'd find that even gods have their moments of restless discomfort. Tonight, as you find yourself wandering in your mind's eye, the marble floors are quiet, and the air is thick with the muted hush of a mountain that never truly sleeps. There, somewhere near the edge of the lesser-known East Wing, Hermes, god of travelers, merchants, and minor inconveniences, paces restlessly. And though the world below is silent, Hermes is far from at ease. This is not the Hermes of grand thefts, clever schemes, or heroic messages. No, tonight Hermes is simply another being haunted by that most mortal of afflictions, a poor night's sleep. While the other gods dream contentedly or brood over grander problems, Hermes has run into something far more tedious, a stiff neck and a persistent crick in his shoulder that refuses to subside. The marble slabs of Olympus, for all their magnificence, are not exactly known for comfort. The other gods, so steeped in divine routines, hardly notice the stony hardness. But Hermes, ever the restless soul, has begun to long for a solution, a simple, portable comfort to support his head and ease his travel-worn bones. And so, on this particular night, the idea comes to him with all the subtlety of a pebble in a sandal. Why not invent something to rest his head upon? But the gods' work, even their small tasks, never happens in a vacuum. To understand why Hermes can't simply conjure a pillow out of thin air, you need to consider the peculiar bureaucracy of Olympus. Every invention, every new object, must be registered, documented, and inspected for divine compliance. Hermes, of all the gods, should know this. After all, he's the unofficial courier of these forms, the relentless messenger of Olympus's endless paperwork. You might imagine that the gods simply willed their comforts into existence, but in truth, they were bound by the rules, by the eternal, meticulous procedures of the fates and the whims of minor household deities who manage the inventory of every bolt of cloth and tuft of wool. For all their power, the Olympians often found themselves tangled in the most mundane bureaucratic details, and so as Hermes hovers at the edge of his personal quarters, he contemplates the challenge not just of invention, but of process. He surveys the room. There is the famed caduceus, the winged sandals gleaming softly in the lamplight, and a scroll half-finished from his latest errand. Nothing here seems remotely suited for comfort. Hermes lies back as he has so many times before, and feels the hard, unyielding surface beneath his head. He twists, sighs, and considers his options. Pillows, in the mortal world, were not entirely unknown. The Egyptians had their wooden headrests. The Babylonians sometimes used folded linens. But the Greeks themselves, for all their advancements, preferred a simple, flat cushion, nothing like the soft, cradling support Hermes yearned for tonight. And so the god of boundaries finds himself at a boundary of his own, between restlessness and invention, tradition and innovation, comfort and duty. The lamp flickers. Hermes sits up, rubs his neck, and starts to scheme. What materials would the gods allow him to use? Would the muses support this small act of creativity? Or would they scoff at such domestic concerns? He recalls with a half-smile that even the greatest innovations often begin with a small discomfort. The bronze plow, the sailing ship, the lyre, each was born from necessity, from a problem that could not be ignored. Why not a pillow? If nothing else, Hermes knows he has always been resourceful. He opens a cabinet, searching through odds and ends left from previous adventures. There are scraps of silken fabric, left over from Aphrodite's last robe, a half-broken sandal strap, bits of stuffing from a ceremonial banner. Nothing quite fits the vision in his mind. Hermes leans against the windowsill, looking down at the world below, at mortals, sleeping soundly on hay, rags, or whatever comfort they could muster. For a moment Hermes envies their simplicity. The mortals did not need to ask permission to rest their heads on whatever was at hand. But on Olympus, even rest is a matter of precedent and ritual. If he were to fashion a pillow, it could not be too grand, lest it offend the muses, nor too humble, lest it be ignored by the household gods. Hermes sighs, then remembers an old tale, how his great-grandfather Uranus once tried to stuff a cloud into a jar for comfort, only to unleash a week-long drizzle over the Aegean. Perhaps, Hermes muses, some ideas are best kept simple. He begins to work quietly. The silk is too thin. It tears. The sandal strap, when wrapped around his head, is more stifling than soothing. The bits of banner stuffing, when bunched together, make a lumpy, awkward bundle. Each attempt, though earnest, falls short of true comfort. The night wears on, the stars shifting above, and Hermes' frustration grows in tandem with his exhaustion. At one point, he wonders if perhaps he is missing something obvious. He recalls the mortals again, how they sometimes used sacks of grain or soft grass to prop up their heads. But Hermes has neither grain nor grass here, only the trappings of divine life: gold, silk, bronze, and endless marble. None of these seem suitable for comfort. In this moment you might notice the irony. The god of travelers, master of adaptability, is thwarted by the lack of something ordinary. Hermes, who could talk his way out of the underworld or sneak past the watchful eyes of giants, cannot conjure a simple pillow, yet he is nothing if not persistent. Hermes settles onto the floor, resting his head on his folded arms, determined to make do. The cold marble seeps through, numbing his thoughts. He closes his eyes, and for a moment, it almost feels like sleep. But then a draft sneaks through, the cracks stirring him awake. He wonders if perhaps comfort is overrated, or perhaps he thinks it's the discomfort that makes innovation possible. Would mortals ever have invented the plow if the earth had been softer? Would sailors have built their ships if the sea were not so restless? Maybe, Hermes considers, a sleepless night is sometimes a gift, a reminder that even the gods are bound by the small nagging problems of existence. The sky outside begins to lighten, a faint blush on the horizon. Hermes sits up, yawns, and contemplates the coming day. He has not found his pillow. But he has perhaps found the seed of an idea, a realization that sometimes the smallest problems are worth solving. As he stretches and looks at the scraps around him, a new question forms in his mind. What would it take to truly invent comfort? Not just for himself, but for gods and mortals alike? And as the first rays of dawn reach the marble halls, Hermes wonders, is it possible that the simplest inventions are the hardest to create? Or is it merely that the gods, in all their wisdom, often overlook the needs of their own weary heads? If you're still with me, listening to the hush of Olympus at dawn, you might sense how a god's frustration is both familiar and distant, how it echoes the small irritations of mortal life, only magnified by eternity. When the sun, finally, crept over the jagged peaks and bathed the marble in its golden glow, Hermes felt an odd heaviness in his chest. It wasn't fatigue, not exactly. He'd felt that often on mortal roads. No, this was something more subtle, a blend of annoyance and longing, the ache of someone who wishes for rest but finds only resistance. Just a little comfort, Hermes muttered to himself, rubbing his eyes with a sigh. Is that so much to ask? The words hung in the cool air, lost in the high ceilings. He'd spent centuries outwitting titans, tricking mortals, racing across the sky. Yet now, faced with a simple, stubborn problem, he felt almost powerless. There was a certain irony in that, one that made him huff, half laughing, half resigned. Even the god of boundaries found his limits here. He paced across the room again, each step echoing like a ticking clock. The detritus of failed experiments, torn silk, twisted sandal leather, the limp remains of a ceremonial banner, seemed to mock him from the floor. For a moment, frustration bubbled up. He wanted to toss the scraps out the window, let them tumble down Mount Olympus and be done with it. But that wouldn't solve anything. Hermes had never been one to give up on a puzzle, no matter how dull or unglamorous it seemed. He leaned against the wall, staring up at the ornate ceiling, and let himself feel the weight of his own small disappointment. Was this all his divinity amounted to, struggling for a moment's peace, a sliver of comfort? Maybe mortals have it right, he said softly, almost wistfully. At least they expect little from the world. The thought stung in a gentle way. It was so easy to envy the simplicity of those below. Outside, Olympus was waking. He could hear Hera's attendants clattering in the halls, the faint song of Apollo's lyre as he rehearsed in another wing. Hermes didn't want company, not this morning, not when his mood felt fragile, caught between exasperation and a faint, stubborn hope. He gathered up his scraps and tried again, quietly determined. He tested each material anew, searching for some spark of inspiration. Silk, soft but too flimsy, wouldn't hold shape. Leather, resilient yet stubborn, bent but did not yield. Even the banner stuffing, he tried fluffing it, folding it, twisting it, collapsed into disappointing lumps. Each failure was a small bruise to his pride, yet also a lesson. "So this is how mortals feel," Hermes murmured, lips tight, working, with whatever they have failing, starting over. It was the sort of frustration that built up slowly, like rainwater collecting in a shallow basin. At times, Hermes felt absurdly alone, his struggles so mundane compared to the grand dramas of Olympus. No one else would care about a god's sore neck or sleepless night. It was a quiet kind of sorrow, a longing for something gentle and ordinary in a world obsessed with spectacle. He remembered childhood evenings, back when he was still a mischievous boy in Maya's cave. She would tuck soft moss and dry leaves under his head, humming ancient lullabies. It was such a distant memory, yet it glowed in his mind now, that deep primal comfort of feeling safe, sheltered, held. Hermes pressed his lips together. It shouldn't be so hard to find that feeling again, he thought. But now everything was marble, silk, and stone. Cold, elegant, and unyielding. He realized suddenly that his frustration wasn't only about pillows or neck aches. It was about loss. The loss of small, everyday comforts, the ordinary things that even a god might crave. He missed Maya's gentle hands, the rustle of leaves, the soft hush of a mountain night. "Maybe that's what this is all about," he whispered, trying to recover something that's already gone. Determined not to wallow, Hermes decided to seek help. But pride prickled beneath his skin. Whom could he trust to understand a problem so trivial? Not Zeus, who was always wrapped in thunder and statecraft. Not Athena, for whom comfort was a distraction from duty. Not even Apollo, who never slept at all. Hermes hesitated at the doorway, the scraps bundled in his arms, feeling a sting of embarrassment. Gods were not supposed to need comfort. Still, he set out, quietly, avoiding the main corridors, searching for the one soul who might remember what it was like to need soft things, Hestia, goddess of the hearth. He found her in her usual spot, tending the sacred flame in the quiet heart of Olympus. The air around her was always warm, always safe, and she looked up as Hermes entered, her face gentle. "Up early, or up all night?" she asked, her tone as soft as a woven blanket. Hermes hesitated, clutching his bundle. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, voice low. "I was trying to make something. For comfort." Hestia smiled, eyes bright with understanding. "There's no shame in that," she said. "Even gods need rest." She invited him to sit beside the fire. The warmth was soothing, and for the first time that night Hermes felt his guard drop just a little. He told her of his failed experiments, the stubborn silk, the lumpen stuffing, the feeling of defeat. Hestia listened patiently. "Softness comes from what's inside, not just the surface," she said, handing him a fresh piece of linen and a small sack of fine, downy feathers. Gifts mortals sometimes brought to her hearth. "Try these, and don't rush. Good comfort is made, not found." Hermes looked at the feathers, surprised by a surge of hope. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I didn't know anyone would understand." Hestia simply smiled. "Everyone wants a place to lay their head, Hermes. Even you." As he left, clutching his new materials, Hermes felt a gentle warmth that was more than just the fire. It was relief, a flicker of companionship, the comfort of being seen. Maybe, he thought, Invention wasn't just about solving problems, but about remembering you weren't alone in facing them. Returning to his chamber, Hermes worked with new care. He stitched the linen, filled it with feathers, pressed it to his cheek. It was still awkward, a little uneven, but for the first time it was soft, truly soft, in a way that eased something inside him. He stretched out on his pallet, feeling the pillow cradle his head, and sighed, a long, deep exhale that released hours of tension. The comfort was not perfect, but it was real. He closed his eyes, letting his mind wander. And yet, something lingered. Had he truly invented the pillow, or simply remembered what comfort felt like? Was it the feathers, the linen, the memory of kindness, or the quiet courage of asking for help that made the difference? As you listen to the soft crackle of Hestia's hearth fading in the distance, the question hovers in the warm air. Is true comfort invented, or is it something we simply recover each time we're brave enough to admit we need it? You might imagine that when a god invents something, the result is swift and dramatic, a sudden flash of genius, a new object shimmering into existence, applause from the heavens. But the truth, as you now know, is usually much slower, quieter, and in its own way a little lonely. When Hermes awoke, if you could call what gods do waking, it was with the faintest impression of peace. His new pillow was uneven, feathers poking through at odd angles, but the ache in his neck had faded. The old tension seemed a little softer, like a problem remembered from a dream. He lingered in that gentle morning light, the pillow still beneath, his head reluctant to rise. But even in Olympus, mornings are for duty. As the gods began their day, Hera already giving instructions in the halls, Apollo tuning his lyre, Ares complaining about a dull spear, Hermes found himself moving through, routine with a small private smile. It wasn't joy, not exactly. It was more subtle, a kind of quiet pride, a satisfaction that came from solving something only he had noticed. He brought the pillow with him as he crossed the airy corridors. At first, he meant to keep it secret. Why invite ridicule for needing comfort? But as he passed by Hestia's hearth, her gentle gaze gave him courage. He stopped to thank her, holding up the lumpy creation. She nodded, understanding more than she said. The pillow was still far from perfect. At breakfast, a stray feather escaped and floated into Hera's honeyed tea. She frowned, but Hermes only smiled sheepishly, apologizing with a playful shrug. The other gods barely noticed. They had their own complaints: lost sandals, an uneven thunderbolt, a cracked amphora. In that moment, Hermes realized how many small discomforts the immortals endured without comment, all for the sake of dignity or habit. He thought about how easy it was to overlook little needs, to assume that being powerful meant never being uncomfortable. Yet here, in the soft cradling of his head, was proof that even a god could long for the ordinary. That thought brought him a surprising tenderness, toward himself, toward his fellow gods, even toward the mortals below. Later that day, as the sun grew hot on the mountain, Hermes found himself summoned to the assembly hall. Zeus was displeased. With the latest cloud arrangements, Athena had a new policy proposal, and Dionysus was lobbying for a holiday devoted to naps. The agenda was long, the debate tedious. Hermes, sitting on a stone bench, slipped his pillow behind his back. The comfort was small but real. He listened to the arguments with new patience. Eventually, curiosity stirred among the gods. "What's that, Hermes?" asked Artemis, her sharp eyes noticing the strange shape beneath his arm. Hermes hesitated, then held up the pillow. "Just a little invention. For comfort." The room went quiet for a heartbeat. Ares snorted, unimpressed. Apollo, always curious, leaned closer. "For comfort? How?" Hermes explained simply. "It eases the neck. You rest your head on it. Mortals use things like this. Soft hay, folded cloaks. I thought, why not try feathers, linen, a little stitching?" Athena, who rarely allowed herself small indulgences, tilted her head. "Does it work?" Hermes nodded. "It's not perfect, but it helps." For a moment, the great hall was silent. Then Hestia smiled, and that was all the approval Hermes needed. He left the meeting that day feeling lighter. The pillow was not a grand invention, not a new constellation or a mighty weapon, but it was a kindness, a simple solution to an everyday problem. It made him think, how many other small discomforts went unspoken, even among gods? How many gentle improvements could be made if only someone dared to name what they needed? That evening, as dusk crept across the sky, Hermes sat at his window and looked down at the mortal world. In tiny villages, shepherds were folding cloaks for pillows. Children curled against their mothers, heads on rough wool. Travelers, weary from the road, sought soft ground wherever they could find it. For the first time, Hermes felt an unexpected kinship with mortals, a bond forged not from power, but from shared need. Perhaps that was the real gift of his sleepless night. Not the invention itself, but the reminder that even the greatest beings were, at heart, shaped by small comforts and gentle mercies. He pressed the pillow to his cheek, feeling the uneven bumps, the faint scent of feathers. It was enough. It was somehow everything. As you listen, maybe you sense it too. A quiet truth, wrapped up in linen and down, that the history of comfort is built moment by moment from the courage to care for ourselves and each other. And so as the stars blinked awake and the world settled into another night, Hermes asked himself a final, lingering question. If even a god must invent his own comfort, what small invention might you give yourself tonight? If you've ever woken up to find something missing, a single sock, a favorite pen, a treasured note, you'll understand in your own quiet way how the gods of Olympus were not immune to the little losses of daily life. There's a peculiar comfort in knowing that even Athena, the wise and watchful, once misplaced something precious. On this particular morning, long before legends became legends and the epics had yet to be sung, Athena discovered her favorite loom had vanished. Vanished. Not just any loom, of course. This was the loom, the one shaped by her own hands, fine-wooded, carved with quiet care, polished by years of weaving. The loom that had seen her through endless hours of contemplation and invention, her solace when Olympus grew too loud, her anchor in the tides of immortality. It was, in the simplest sense, her comfort. It's easy to picture Athena in her armor, standing resolute, bronze glinting, eyes fierce and sharp. But not today. On this morning she is softer. Her sandals are not yet buckled. Her hair is only half-braided. She sits quietly by the window, watching the first sunlight spill across the marble, feeling a gentle ache of longing for her lost loom. She retraces her steps, mind moving with the slow patience of someone well-practiced in finding lost things. Perhaps I left it in the north corridor, she thinks, recalling the afternoon she helped Hestia repair a broken spindle. Or maybe it's in the study, tucked behind a stack of scrolls, lost beneath the dust of unfinished plans. But no matter how carefully she searches, the loom is nowhere to be found. She checks the weaving room, the sacred space at the heart of her domain. Here the air always smells faintly of lanolin and fresh linen. Spools of wool and baskets of thread line the walls, everything just as she left it. But the empty space where the loom should rest looks back at her, silent and expectant. Athena sighs, the sound barely more than a whisper. It can't have gone far, she tells herself. But uncertainty tugs at her, small and persistent. You might imagine the loss of a loom is trivial, even for a goddess. After all, Athena had hundreds of tools, gifted by grateful mortals and inspired muses. Yet this loom was different. It held the memory of quiet nights, the gentle hum of thread, the steady comfort of creation. It was, in some quiet way, her companion. To lose it felt strangely like losing a part of herself. Olympus, for all its marble grandeur, is filled with clutter. Hallways wind in on themselves. Rooms multiply with the whims of their divine inhabitants. Athena passes Artemis, who is balancing a quiver and a pot of honey, and asks as casually as she can, "You haven't seen my loom, have you?" Artemis shakes her head. Not since the last festival. Maybe ask Hephaestus. He borrowed some tools last week. Athena nods, trying not to let her worry show, and continues on. It's not long before the rumor spreads. Hera hears of the missing loom and offers a well-meaning, if unhelpful, suggestion about misplacing things with age. Dionysus laughs, promising to search after his morning nap. Even Apollo pauses his tuning, raising an eyebrow at the goddess of wisdom misplacing her own handiwork, yet, beneath the gentle teasing and distracted concern, Athena feels something she rarely allows herself. A flicker of frustration, a flash of vulnerability. How can I protect mortals, counsel kings, devise war strategies, she wonders, if I can't keep track of my own belongings? The thought lingers sharper than she'd like. She is, after all, supposed to be above such things. She makes her way to Hephaestus's forge. The god of smiths is hunched over a new invention, sweat streaking his brow, the air thick with the scent of heated bronze. Athena waits patiently for him to finish his work. She has always admired the way he loses himself in creation, forgetting the world beyond his tools. When he finally looks up, she asks, quietly, "Hephaestus, have you seen my loom?" He shakes, his head, brow furrowed. "No, but I'll keep an eye out. You know how things wander off around here." Athena nods, the weight of her worry growing heavier. She can't quite bring herself to mention how important this loom is, not just for its craftsmanship, but for the comfort it gives her in quiet moments. It's the sort of detail that gets lost in stories, yet shapes entire days. She thanks Hephaestus and continues her search. The day stretches on. Athena moves from room to room, searching in increasingly unlikely places. She looks beneath stacks of unspun wool, inside vases behind columns. Each time she finds nothing, her mood darkens a shade. The palace grows louder, more chaotic, as the gods pursue their own dramas. Athena's loss, so small in the grand scheme of things, begins to feel immense. By late afternoon, she finds herself in the garden. The air is still and warm, scented with thyme and lavender. For a moment, she sits among the olive trees, letting the sunlight filter over her. She closes her eyes, remembering the rhythm of weaving, the feel of thread slipping between her fingers. The loom is gone, but the memory is vivid, almost painful in its clarity. She wonders quietly if perhaps she's clung too tightly to old comforts. Is it possible, she asks herself, that the loom was never as important as I believed? Or does its absence reveal just how much I relied on it? The question lingers, gentle and unsettling. You too may have felt this. The loss of something small, ordinary, and deeply cherished. A mug, a blanket, a photograph. The world goes on, yet something in you aches. Athena's strength was never in her armor or her wisdom alone. It was in her willingness to feel, to notice the absence, to search for what was lost. The sun drifts lower, shadows stretching across the garden. Athena stands smoothing her robe, determination settling in her chest. She will find the loom, or failing that, she will find a way to weave again. The day is not over. The search continues. As dusk settles over Olympus, Athena returns inside. The halls are quieter now, the bustle of the day fading into evening stillness. The empty space where her loom should rest calls to her, soft and insistent. She pauses, her hand resting on the doorway, and asks herself a simple question, one that carries all the weight of her worry, her longing, her quiet hope. If the loom cannot be found, what will I do with these empty hands? If you listen carefully, you'll notice how the stillness of Olympus after sunset carries a different kind of weight. The bustle of day has faded, no more laughter echoing through the corridors, no clattering of armor, no sudden bursts of divine argument. In this hush, Athena's search takes on a more contemplative shape, the urgency softening into something quieter, a longing both tender and persistent. Alone now, she returns to her weaving room. The emptiness greets her, unchanged. It's strange, she thinks, how loss can remake a place so completely. The missing loom isn't just an object, It's an absence that seems to echo off every wall, a silent shape in the air. She closes her eyes, searching her memory for a clue, some forgotten gesture, some careless moment when she set the loom aside. But her mind is tired. The hours of searching, the constant second-guessing weigh on her like a stone. She sits on the cool marble floor, her robe pooling around her, and allows herself, just for a moment, to feel the full ache of loss. It's a humble pain, small and steady, without drama. In another life, perhaps she would have wept, but Athena has learned to sit with her sadness, quietly, honestly, letting it wash over her without shame. You might think it strange, the goddess of wisdom feeling so much over something so ordinary. But in the little rituals of daily life, threading the shuttle, tying off a line, feeling the gentle resistance of the warp, Athena found a peace that even immortality rarely offered. The loom wasn't just a tool, it was a touchstone, a quiet companion through centuries of noise and duty. Where could it have gone, she whispers, her voice barely louder than the hush of distant wind. There's no answer, only the creak of the olive branches outside, the faint scent of lavender drifting in. She remembers her earliest lessons, her mother's gentle hands guiding hers, the first time she wove wool into something strong and warm. Those memories shimmer now, more precious for being fragile. A small sound breaks her reverie. The door creaks and Hestia slips inside, her presence gentle as always. She brings a cup of warm honeyed milk, setting it beside Athena with a kind smile. You've been searching all day, Hestia says quietly, sitting beside her. You must be exhausted. Athena nods, grateful for the company. She sips the milk, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. For a few minutes, neither speaks. The silence is comfortable, soft as old wool. It's only a loom, Athena says, at last, but the words are a fragile shield. Hestia doesn't challenge her. She only nods, her eyes bright with understanding. We all have something like that, Hestia says gently. A thing that makes us feel like ourselves. When it's gone, it leaves a space nothing else can fill. Not right away. Athena's throat tightens. I've spent the whole day retracing my steps, searching everywhere. I keep thinking if I just remember, if I look in one more place, I'll find it. But it's as if it vanished on its own, like it was never really mine. Hestia looks thoughtful. Sometimes when I lose something, I try to make space for the loss itself. I sit with it, let myself feel it fully. Only then do I remember what really mattered about what's gone. Athena nods, the advice sinking in. She lets herself remember, not just the object, but the hours spent weaving, the sense of focus, the way her mind could wander freely while her hands worked. She remembers teaching mortals to spin and weave, guiding them through the simple patterns that would keep their families warm. She remembers the quiet pride in their eyes, the gratitude for something as basic as a blanket. Outside, the moon rises, casting long, gentle beams across the weaving room. Athena watches the shifting light, her mind drifting to the mortals below. How many of them, at this very moment, search for lost things in the dim corners of their own homes? How many feel that quiet ache, that longing for something ordinary and irreplaceable? The hours slip by in companionable silence. Eventually, Hestia leaves, her warmth lingering in the room. Athena remains, sitting on the floor, the cup empty beside her. She closes her eyes and imagines weaving without the loom. Just her hands, some stray threads, the memory of the motions. She flexes her fingers, feeling the phantom tug of thread, the muscle memory of 1,000 patient repetitions. For the first time all day, she allows herself to consider. If I never find the loom, could I begin again? Could I carve a new one, shape it with the wisdom of my loss? The thought is both frightening and freeing. Perhaps what mattered most was not the loom itself, but the act of creating, of losing and beginning again. She stands, stretching the stiffness from her shoulders. The room is still empty, the loss still real, but her heart feels lighter. There is, in the quiet, a kind of invitation to grieve, yes, but also to hope. As she prepares for sleep, Athena gazes out at the starlit sky. Somewhere out there, mortals and gods alike are searching for what's been lost. Somewhere, new looms are waiting to be carved, new threads waiting to be spun. Before she closes her eyes, a question whispers in her mind. Soft, persistent, full of quiet longing. When something beloved is lost, is it ever truly gone, or does it wait for us in the act of beginning anew? You may find, if you've ever truly lost something precious, that there's a peculiar clarity in the morning after. The sharpness of loss dulls just enough for hope to seep in through the cracks. As dawn touches the marble columns of Olympus, Athena rises from her restless sleep. There is no loom waiting for her in the weaving room, only the familiar emptiness and the memory of all the time she sat here, hands moving with the quiet patience of centuries. She lingers at the threshold, letting the hush of early light wash over her. Her mind is strangely clear. The ache in her chest remains, but something has shifted. Where before there was only absence, now there is a slender thread of resolve. If she cannot find her loom, perhaps she can create again. Differently, imperfectly, but honestly. Athena collects a few simple things. An olive branch, a scrap of linen, a handful of colored wool left over from her last project. She sits by the window, cross-legged on the cool stone, and begins to twist the wool with her fingers. The movement is awkward at first, the fibers slipping apart, refusing to hold, but she persists, drawing on old lessons, patient with her own uncertainty. Her first attempt yields a lumpy, uneven cord. She smiles wryly, amused by her own clumsiness. Even goddesses must begin again, she murmurs. The thought feels oddly comforting, almost freeing. She tries again and again, the thread growing steadier, the pattern slowly emerging. Each movement is an act of remembering, not just of skill but of trust, in herself, in the simple magic of creation. Time passes gently. She loses herself in the quiet rhythm, the sun warming her shoulders, the sounds of Olympus fading into background noise. For a while there is only the twisting of wool, the soft scratch of linen, the growing sense that she is not truly alone. Her mother's voice, Hestia's advice, the long line of mortal weavers who learned at her side, all present in memory. Later, as midday approaches, a faint knock comes at the door. Athena looks up to see a young mortal girl guided by Iris, the rainbow messenger. The girl carries a bundle, plain and unassuming, wrapped in a cloth the color of morning sky. She bows, shyly offering it up. "My lady," she says, voice trembling, "I found this on the riverbank downstream from Olympus. I thought, perhaps it belonged to you." Athena's heart lifts, a mix of disbelief and quiet joy. She unwraps the bundle with trembling hands, and there it is. Her loom, battered but whole, a few new scratches marring its polished wood. She traces the familiar carvings, the worn edges, relief flooding through her. "Thank you," she whispers, her voice thick with gratitude. She smiles at the girl, pressing a silver brooch into her palm. "You have returned more than a loom today." The girl beams, and Athena watches her leave, heart swelling with gentle pride. She sits with her loom for a long while, cradling it as one would a long-lost friend. Yet even in her joy, she notices something subtle. She is not the same goddess who lost the loom yesterday. She has learned in these short hours that she can weave with or without it, that creation begins not with tools, but with courage and memory. She spends the afternoon repairing the loom, smoothing the new scratches, retightening loose pegs. Each task is slow, methodical, grounding. When she finally sets thread to wood, the shuttle slides through the warp with a familiar whisper. The cloth grows beneath her fingers, imperfect, beautiful, alive. Olympus is quieter than usual, as if the palace itself understands the importance of this moment. Hestia passes by and smiles. Artemis pauses in the doorway, nodding approval, and even Hera from a distance softens her gaze. Athena weaves, not for the gods or for mortals, but for herself, for the comfort of routine, the dignity of beginning anew. By evening, a fresh length of cloth rests in her lap, the colors warm and welcoming. She sets down her tools, feeling the weight of relief settle over her. The loss, the search, the creation, each has shaped her in ways she could not have foreseen. As darkness falls, Athena stands in her weaving room, hands resting on her restored loom. She feels gratitude for the kindness of strangers, the wisdom of friends, the resilience found in sorrow. The loom may be scratched, her heart may still ache, but she is stronger for having lost and found again. She looks out at the night, stars glinting in the vast sky, and asks herself, and you, one last, lingering question. Is it in losing that we learn what truly matters? Or in the courage to weave again no matter what remains in our hands? If you've ever stood up to speak and felt your mind go strangely blank, you know something of what even the most gifted gods have felt. The halls of Olympus were wide and echoing, filled with laughter and legend, but on some days, they were simply spaces where mistakes unfolded, quietly, in full view of eternity. On one such morning, Apollo, radiant and self-assured, found himself at the center of attention, and for the first time in memory, quite lost for words. Apollo was known across all lands as the god of music, poetry, prophecy, and light. His golden lyre was said to calm storms and inspire hope. Mortals built shrines to him for his gifts. Even the other gods, rarely impressed by each other, admitted privately that his music could change the very air. It was tradition, then, that at the first gathering of each new season, Apollo would offer a hymn to mark the turning of time. This was not an event of thunder or spectacle. The gathering was as ordinary as Olympus ever became, a circle of gods sipping honeyed wine, the air scented with laurel and olive oil, voices subdued and reflective. You can imagine the scene. Hera listening with regal stillness, Athena with her thoughtful frown, Dionysus humming under his breath, and Hestia quietly darning a corner of her robe. It was a ritual, comfortable in its repetition. Apollo arrived, with his usual grace, lyre in hand, sunlight rippling across his shoulders. He smiled, greeting each god in turn, offering small pleasantries. May your olives be ripe this year, Demeter. May your forge burn evenly, Hephaestus. All was as it should be, and he felt the familiar ease that came with his place among them. He took his seat on the marble bench, tuned his strings, and waited for silence to settle. But as Apollo opened his mouth to begin the ancient hymn, one he had sung countless times, a melody woven through the centuries, something peculiar happened. The words, so familiar, slipped away like water through his fingers. His mind, usually a treasury of verses and harmonies, stood empty, silent. The notes wavered. His hands hovered above the lyre. Nothing came. A hush fell over the gathering, not the polite pause of anticipation, but a longer, heavier silence, as if Olympus itself was holding its breath. Apollo's heart beat just a little faster, though his face betrayed nothing. He stared at his hands, willing the words to come, but the harder he searched, the more distant they seemed. Perhaps if I start with the refrain, he thought, the rest will follow. He strummed a tentative chord, soft, golden, incomplete. Instead, the melody faltered, breaking mid-phrase. A single note echoed across the marble, then faded. Apollo cleared his throat, searching the faces around him for a lifeline, a hint of the next line. Hera arched a brow. Athena looked politely away, not wanting to deepen his embarrassment. Dionysus raised his goblet, grinning, and Artemis offered an encouraging smile, mouthing the opening word, but even that didn't help. You might expect a god to recover quickly, to laugh off a small failure. But Apollo's pride was a quiet thing, deep-rooted, old as sunlight itself. He felt a flush creep up his neck, a feeling mortals would call embarrassment, but which for a god was tinged with something heavier, the fear of being seen as less than perfect. He tried again, fingers brushing the strings, mouth forming shapes that would not become words. words. The silence deepened, becoming almost companionable in its awkwardness. For the first time, Apollo noticed the mundane details, the warmth of the sun on the marble, the low buzz of bees outside the window, the gentle clink of Hestia's needle. In the stillness, his failure was both huge and strangely insignificant. A single skipped note in the endless song of Olympus. He let his hands drop to his lap, meeting the gaze of his audience. "It seems," he said, voice gentle and rueful, "even I can forget the words once in a while." The gods smiled, some with sympathy, some with relief. For a moment, the distance between them shrank. Apollo was not only the god of music, but also, on this morning, a companion in imperfection. After the gathering dispersed, Apollo lingered in the empty hall, the notes of the lost hymn still echoing in his mind. He set aside his lyre, letting his fingers trace the carvings on its golden frame. "How strange," he murmured, "to lose what has always come so easily." The words were soft, tinged with wonder, frustration, and a quiet yearning to understand. He wandered outside, letting the air clear his mind. The gardens were full of gentle noise, doves cooing, olive leaves rustling, a fountain bubbling in the distance. Apollo sat beneath a laurel tree, the memory of his forgotten song prickling at the edge of his thoughts. He wondered if this was how mortals felt, reaching for words just out of grasp, yearning to remember what once seemed natural. You too may have found yourself suddenly blank, forgetting a line, a tune, a name you've always known. The world tilts for a moment, and you are left searching the silence for a sign. Apollo, for all his gifts, was not immune. He closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of warm earth and ancient trees, and tried to let go of the need for perfection. He promised himself he would find the lost hymn again. Perhaps he would search the old scrolls or ask the muses for their counsel. Perhaps more simply he would listen, patiently, quietly, for the words to return, carried on the wind or waiting in some forgotten corner of his mind. As the sun drifted lower and shadows lengthened across Olympus, Apollo posed himself a gentle question, one that you might also hold. When the words vanish, is it failure, or simply a chance to listen anew and remember what truly matters beneath the song? If you've ever tried to recall something on the tip of your tongue, a song, a scent, a half-remembered phrase, you know the subtle ache that follows. For Apollo, the day after his forgotten hymn unfolded with this quiet discomfort, a faint restlessness trailing him through the golden halls of Olympus. The gods had moved on as they always did, swept up in their own intrigues and rituals. But for Apollo, the silence of his lapse clung like morning mist. He woke before dawn, sunlight barely edging the clouds, and paced his quarters, the lost hymn echoing somewhere just beyond reach. He hummed fragments under his breath, testing each phrase, but the melody slipped away, evasive and delicate. He gathered his lyre, fingers moving through familiar scales, and let the notes wander. There was beauty in the music, yes, but the particular cadence, the pattern of that ancient hymn, remained elusive. Apollo frowned, not in anger, but in mild, stubborn puzzlement. How could something so deeply woven into his memory simply vanish? He left his chambers and drifted through the gardens, pausing beneath a fig tree. The air was cool, scented with dew and laurel. He found himself watching the mortals below, tending their early tasks, gathering water, feeding animals, singing work, songs and voices rough with sleep. The simplicity of their routines soothed him. For a moment Apollo listened, really listened, letting the rhythm of their world fill the spaces where his own song had faded. Perhaps, he thought, I have been too proud of my certainty. For centuries, Apollo had been sure of himself, his talent, his knowledge, his role among gods and mortals. This small stumble, this quiet forgetting, unsettled him in a way he had never anticipated, yet it also made him gentle, patient, more willing to listen than to lead. He sought out the muses, his oldest companions. In a shaded glen, he found Calliope reciting poetry, Clio with her scrolls, Erato humming quietly to herself. Apollo greeted, them, offering his usual warmth, but the concern in his eyes did not go unnoticed. "Lost something, brother?" Erato asked, her tone light. Apollo nodded, hesitant. "I've misplaced a hymn, the one we sing at the turning of the season. I tried to recall it, but the words, they slipped away." The muses exchanged glances, gentle, understanding, never mocking. "It happens," Calliope said. "Even to us. Songs come and go, like rivers in the spring. Sometimes what's lost returns when we least expect it." Apollo sat among them, feeling the comfort of their company. For a while they sang together. Old melodies, new fragments, music that rose and fell like breath. The lost hymn did not appear, but the act of singing softened Apollo's disappointment. He realized he was not alone in his forgetting. Even the muses, guardians of memory, let songs slip through their fingers. Afterwards, Apollo wandered to the library, where Athena, as usual, sat amid scrolls and tablets. She looked up, sensing his quiet frustration. "Still searching?" she asked. He nodded. "It's as if the hymn never existed. I remember moments, the shape of the melody, the way sunlight fell on the hall during the last verse, but the words themselves..." He shook his head, lips pressing into a thin line. Athena offered a sympathetic smile. "Sometimes we remember the feeling more than the form, the comfort of repetition, the quiet pride in tradition. Perhaps you're looking in the wrong place." Apollo sat, closing his eyes. He tried not to force memory, but to invite it, gently, as one coaxes a bird, to the hand. He pictured that first gathering, the warmth of the marble beneath his feet, the faces of his family, the hush of expectation, the way the music soothed even the hardest hearts. The hymn had never been just words. It had been a vessel for belonging, a ritual that drew the gods together year after year. He realized slowly that what he truly missed was not the hymn itself, but the moment it created. The act of offering, the shared breath, the soft gratitude of his listeners. Maybe, he thought, the song is not lost at all. Maybe it lives in the space between us, waiting to be found again, differently, honestly, imperfectly. As dusk approached, Apollo took his lyre to the highest terrace. The sky was streaked with pink and gold. He played quietly, inventing new patterns, letting the old shapes blend with the new. The words did not return, but a gentle peace settled over him. Sometimes forgetting is not a failure, but an invitation. To listen anew, to trust the silence, to begin again. He looked out over the darkening world, the first stars glimmering, and let the night settle around him. In that hush, he posed a gentle question, for himself and for anyone who has lost their song. When memory fails, can we find our way by the feelings that remain, trusting that what's essential endures beyond the words? Morning returns to Olympus with a gentle hush. The previous day's embarrassment has faded into the broader pattern of immortal life, a small ripple in a vast sea. Yet Apollo still feels its quiet aftertaste, a gentle reminder, persistent but not unkind, that even gods are shaped by what they forget. He moves through his routine with calm acceptance, not rushing, no longer searching the corners of his mind for lost lyrics. In the kitchen, Hestia greets him with a nod and a small understanding smile. "Did you find your song?" she asks, her voice soft as dawn. Apollo considers the question for a long moment. "Not the old one," he says, "but perhaps something new." He finds himself drawn to the terrace where the day before he'd played to the stars. The marble is cool under his feet. The sky is already brightening, the horizon painted with soft gold and lavender. He sits with his lyre and lets his hands drift along the strings, no plan, no pressure, just the act of playing for its own sake. As the music grows, other gods begin to gather. Not all at once, just a few, curious and quietly supportive. Artemis sits cross-legged, back against a pillar. Dionysus, still drowsy from the night, sips at a cup of sweet wine. Athena lingers in the doorway, scroll in hand, pausing to listen. The atmosphere is different from before, looser, less ceremonial, threaded with gentle expectation. Apollo's music is not the hymn he once sang, but it is honest. He weaves new melodies from the memory of old ones, blending the spirit of tradition with the improvisation of the present. At times, fragments of the lost hymn surface, an echo of a refrain, a familiar chord, but they drift away again, and he does not chase them. He realizes, as he plays, that the true gift was never the perfection of memory, but the courage to begin again, to make something new from the ashes of what was lost. The other gods seem to understand. They do not ask for the old song. They accept the new one, letting it fill the air, soft and unhurried until it feels like it has always belonged. As the last note lingers, Apollo looks around at his family. He sees not disappointment, but a quiet pride. Even his own heart feels lighter, not because he has remembered, but because he has allowed himself to move forward. Later, as the gods return to their morning tasks, Apollo sits in the gentle quiet and reflects. He thinks of mortals below, who forget and remember, who lose and create, who mourn what's gone and celebrate what comes in its place. He feels closer to them than ever, a god shaped not just by his gifts, but by his limits. Before he puts his lyre away, Apollo lets his mind rest on a final question, one he leaves for you as well. Is the truest song the one we remember perfectly, or the one we dare to create when memory fails, trusting that our honest efforts will carry us forward into the light? If you pause for a moment and listen to the gentle rhythm of a quiet home, you'll hear the soft pulse of comfort. An old chair, a warm cup, a familiar glow from the hearth. On Olympus, that glow was not just a comfort, but a necessity. It was the steady work of Hestia, goddess of the hearth, who kept the sacred fire burning at the center of it all. Her presence was a balm, her warmth the subtle thread that bound the palace and its inhabitants together. But on one particular morning, Hestia awoke to a silence deeper than usual, a silence that told her, before she even opened her eyes, that something was missing. She rose as she always did, careful and deliberate, her movements as familiar as breath. The halls were bathed in the silver hush before dawn. Hestia's chambers were spare and unadorned, the only extravagance a thick woolen blanket she had woven herself, practical and soft. She walked quietly to the central hall, expecting the faint warmth and orange flicker of the sacred hearth. Instead, she found only darkness and a cold ring of ash. At first, Hestia felt only a subtle confusion. She'd tended the fire before sleep, as she did every night, feeding it with olive wood and a whispered blessing. She checked the logs, touched the old iron poker, searched for a stray breeze that might have snuffed the flames. But the hearth was empty. Not merely extinguished, the very stone at its center, the foundation of the sacred flame, was gone. You might think that on Olympus, with all its drama and thunder, the loss of a stone would go unnoticed. Yet this stone was different. It was as old as the mountain itself, shaped by hands long before Hestia's, warmed by countless fires. The gods said it anchored the world, that without it, the palace would drift ever so slightly, the axis of divine life tilting into quiet chaos. For Hestia, it was more personal. It was the first thing she had been trusted to care for, the responsibility that made her feel needed among her more spectacular siblings. Hestia knelt by the hearth, hands folded, in her lap, and let herself feel the loss. It was a gentle ache, no panic, no drama, just a soft, persistent sense that something essential had slipped away. She glanced around the hall, listening for the faintest hint of a clue, a misplaced ember, a footprint in the ash, a whisper of movement from the night before. Nothing, only the silence and the faint scent of cooled wood. She considered calling out to the others, but hesitated. The gods were often absorbed in their own grand concerns. Zeus was likely tangled in a debate about clouds and thunder, Athena deep in her scrolls, Apollo humming through new melodies. Even in a palace full of immortals, Hestia often felt invisible, her work unremarked, her presence felt only in its absence. She took a slow breath, letting the air fill her lungs. The quiet steadied her, gave her time to think. Where could the hearthstone have gone? Had someone borrowed it, not knowing its purpose? Had it simply vanished, as things sometimes do in the winding labyrinth of Olympus? The possibilities turned over in her mind, each as unlikely as the next. She began her search not with urgency, but with method, a gentle process, touching every surface, pausing in every shadow. Hestia traced her route from the night before, remembering each small ritual, the blessing, the tending, the slow retreat to bed. The memories were intact, unbroken, yet the stone remained missing. She ran her hand along the cool marble of the hearth, feeling for the shape that was no longer there. A wave of longing passed through her, quiet, but deep. She remembered the first time she had been entrusted with the hearth, the pride that bloomed quietly in her chest. To lose it now, she whispered, is to lose the center of my work. The palace began to wake around her, soft footsteps in distant corridors, the distant call of a dove. Hestia slipped through the halls, moving quietly past sleeping gods and snoring satyrs. She peeked into storage rooms, gently opened unused cupboards, checked the corners of the kitchen where old utensils gathered dust. Each room held 1,000 memories, but no sign of the sacred stone. She stopped by the gardens, letting the morning breeze brush her cheek. She watched the dew collect on the leaves, sunlight stretching across olive branches. For a moment, she let herself be still, hands folded, face warmed by the promise of a new day. The stone was gone, yes, but the world had not ended. The birds still sang. The breeze still moved. Returning inside, Hestia found herself drawn to the hearth again, kneeling before its empty center. She whispered an old prayer, half for guidance, half for comfort. If the heart of the home can vanish, she wondered, what keeps us steady when the center is lost? The fire would wait, she knew, until she found what was missing or found a way to begin again. For now there was only the quiet and the echo of a question, soft as ash in the air. When the center is gone, can warmth still find its way into our days? When a day begins with loss, even the ordinary routines take on a different weight. Hestia moved quietly through Olympus, the memory of the missing hearthstone pressing gently against every step. The palace around her seemed unchanged. Sunlight streaming in soft golden beams, the familiar patterns of laughter, argument, and footsteps echoing along marble floors. But for Hestia, the silence in the hearth hall shaped everything. A subtle ache threading through her morning, she returned to the empty hearth, kneeling once more where the fire should be. The marble felt cool beneath her palms, and she traced the outline where the stone once sat. Perhaps, she thought, this is what it means to care for something deeply. Its absence feels as real as its presence ever did. She let the feeling settle, neither pushing it away nor giving in to despair. You might imagine the gods would leap into action, eager to solve a mystery in their midst. But Olympus was slow to notice the little shifts in daily life. Most gods were distracted with their own schemes. Ares polishing armor, Demeter tending to her gardens, Aphrodite admiring her reflection in a silver basin. It was only Hermes, ever curious and always on the move, who paused as he passed the hearth hall. He stopped, noticing the stillness. "No fire this morning, Hestia?" he asked, tone gentle, eyes bright with concern. Hestia shook her head. "The hearthstone is missing. I don't know how or when. I've searched everywhere I can think of." Hermes sat beside her, his usual restlessness quieted by her mood. He considered the problem, tracing the empty space with his finger. "Things vanish here all the time," he said, a slight smile flickering. "Sometimes I think Olympus itself is hungry for keepsakes, but not the hearthstone. That's different." They searched together, moving through storerooms and kitchens, up spiral staircases into forgotten alcoves lined with dust and echoes. Hermes made a game of it, suggesting improbable hiding places, peeking under rugs and behind tapestries, lifting cushions with exaggerated care. His humor was gentle, never mocking, an attempt to lighten Hestia's mood. Yet with every room explored, the absence grew heavier. It must be somewhere, Hestia said, quietly determined. A thing so old doesn't simply disappear. Hermes paused in a narrow corridor, thinking. Who else would have reason to visit the hearth after you left last night? Hestia frowned, recalling the evening's rhythm. The palace had been busy, a small celebration in honor of a new constellation. She remembered laughter, the smell of honey cakes, the feeling of warmth, the kind that fills a home rather than a hall. She remembered Artemis stopping by for a quiet word, Demeter pausing to leave a garland on the mantel, even Zeus glancing in as he passed, but none seemed likely to disturb the stone itself. She thanked Hermes for his help, her gratitude quiet but sincere. If you hear anything, she said, will you let me know? Of course, he replied, giving her hand a quick, reassuring squeeze. Then he vanished down the hall, sandals whispering over stone. Left alone, Hestia wandered outside. She found herself in the garden again among the olive trees and sun-warmed stones. She sat beneath a gnarled trunk, the morning air gentle on her face. The world outside Olympus was waking. She could hear distant voices of mortals, the bray of a donkey, the clang of a far-off blacksmith's hammer. She closed her eyes, letting the ordinary sounds soothe her. She remembered her earliest days when the gods were young, and even immortals were unsure of their place. Back then, the hearthstone was little more than a block of basalt, rough and unremarkable, but it became precious because it was steady, a center in a shifting world. Perhaps, she wondered, the value of things grows in their keeping, not their making. The thought brought her a small comfort. She returned to the palace, renewed by the quiet steadiness of the garden. As she walked, she noticed the way's warmth found its way into every corner. Aphrodite laughing with a handmaid, Demeter singing softly to a sapling, Artemis napping in a patch of sunlight. Even without the sacred flame, Olympus was alive with quiet acts of care. In the evening, as dusk fell, Hestia sat by the cold hearth. She wrapped herself in her woven blanket, sipping warm milk from a plain clay cup. The stone was still missing, the fire was still out, but the comfort of her routine, the simple acts of tending, seeking, and waiting remained. She closed her eyes, listening to the hush. Perhaps, she thought, the heart of the home is not a stone or a flame, but the gentle intention to keep others warm. If I cannot find the center, she asked herself, can I still kindle comfort from memory, from patience, from love? As the stars brightened over Olympus, Hestia let the questions settle around her, soft as dusk. When what we cherish is lost, can the act of caring become the new hearth, quietly holding the warmth until the center is found again? If you've ever searched for something precious and feared it might be gone forever, you know the mixture of hope and resignation that fills each new morning. For Hestia, another sunrise brought the same quiet ache. A hearth without a center, a day shaped by the longing for what once seemed immovable. She woke early, as always, guided by the habits of care she'd practiced for centuries. The marble beneath her feet was cold, and the hall was still shadowed in the half-light of dawn. She paused at the empty hearth, her heart giving a small, familiar tug. The fire would have to wait. There was nothing to build it upon. But even in her disappointment, she felt a gentle determination growing inside her, a resolve to carry on, to keep searching, to trust in the small routines that gave her comfort. Word of the missing hearthstone had finally reached the other gods. One by one, they came to check the hearth, offering theories, suggestions, and occasionally comfort. Ares insisted it must have been stolen by some impudent satyr. Apollo, ever hopeful, promised to search the gardens for any sign of the stone's return. Athena, ever rational, drew up a list of all the palace guests from the night before and began a meticulous inquiry. But Hestia, for all their well-meaning efforts, found herself leaning most on her own quiet intuition. She sat by the hearth each evening, letting the cool air brush her face, and whispered old prayers into the silence. "If you can hear me, come home," she would say, voice barely a breath. She did not expect an answer, but the act of speaking brought her peace. One evening, just as dusk was slipping into night, Hermes appeared at her side. He carried a small bundle, wrapped in a faded cloth. His eyes were bright and a hint of triumph danced in his smile. "I found it," he said, gently placing the bundle in her lap. Hestia unwrapped it slowly, her hands trembling just a little. There it was, the hearthstone, heavy and familiar, its surface marked by centuries of warmth and care. She pressed her palms to its roughness, relief blossoming through her chest. Tears pricked her eyes, quiet tears, born not just from joy but from the release of days spent worrying, waiting, and hoping. Hermes sat beside her, not speaking, simply sharing the moment. Hestia drew in a deep, steady breath, letting the simple reality of return settle in her heart. The stone was chipped at one corner, a new imperfection among many, but it felt more precious for having been lost and found again. Together, they set the stone back in its place at the heart of the hearth. Hestia prepared the wood with care, arranging each piece with reverence, and whispered her old blessing over the pile. When she struck the spark, the flame caught and leapt up, gentle at first, then bright and sure, its warmth spilling out into the hall. The other gods gathered as the news spread. They stood quietly in the glow, some smiling, some lost in thought. For a moment, there was only the warmth, the steady dance of fire, and the comfort of knowing that even lost things can return, changed, perhaps, but cherished all the more. Hestia watched the flames, hands folded in her lap. She realized that while the hearthstone mattered, the rituals of care and the community that grew around them were what truly kept the home alive. The fire was more than heat and light. It was the quiet heart of belonging. As night deepened and the others drifted away, Hestia remained by the hearth, the gentle heat brushing her cheeks. She allowed herself a final, peaceful sigh, a release of tension, an embrace of gratitude. The stone was home, and so was she. And as the embers settled and the palace grew quiet once more, Hestia wondered, and perhaps you might as well, is it the stone, the flame, or the simple act of tending that holds a home together, especially when the center is found, lost and found again? If you listen closely, you can hear the slow, dependable heartbeat of daily life in ancient Athens, the soft shuffling of sandals on dusty roads, the rustle of grain in the breeze, the echo of laughter and quiet conversation at dawn. Before the city became legend, before philosophers and poets, before grand victories and tragedies, Athens was a city built on the simplest rhythms of survival, and at its heart was bread. Bread was not a luxury. It was the cornerstone of every meal, the anchor for rich and poor alike. Yet the act of making bread, day after day, could feel less like a miracle and more like a chore, a fact that even the gods recognized. It was Demeter, goddess of the harvest, who first took notice of the quiet exhaustion of those who fed the city, and who decided, one ordinary season, to offer her own lessons to Athens. Demeter was not one for spectacle. While her daughter Persephone moved through the underworld with drama and sorrow, Demeter preferred the patient work of planting, tending, and reaping. Her temples were filled not with gold, but with bundles of wheat, smooth stones, and hand-carved tools. She moved through the fields in plain sandals, her hands stained with earth, her presence felt most in the gentle turning of seasons. You might imagine the goddess arriving in a rush of wind or a shimmer of gold, but her lessons began more quietly. One morning, as the first light crept over the hills, she appeared at the edge of a humble farmstead, her hair hidden beneath a worn headscarf, her robes dusted with flour. She joined a small circle of women gathered around the communal oven, nodding in greeting as if she were just another neighbor. The women of Athens eyed her curiously, but Demeter's gentle authority soon set them at ease. She asked simple questions: how much grain they'd gathered this year, how long their dough took to rise, what tricks they used to keep the loaves from burning. Her voice was soft, her laughter low and steady. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did offer advice, it was woven into stories of distant fields and forgotten seasons. Together, they prepared the dough, mixing coarse flour with water and a little wild yeast, kneading it until their arms ached. The work was repetitive, sometimes dull, but Demeter's presence turned it into something almost sacred. She spoke of patience, the way bread needed time to rise, the way fields needed rest between harvests, the quiet power of waiting. "You cannot rush the earth," she said, shaping a rough loaf in her hands. "Bread made in haste is bread that will not last. Let it rise in its own time, and it will feed your family through lean months and plenty alike." As the sun climbed higher, the small kitchen grew warm and fragrant. The loaves were simple, round, dense, with thick crusts and plain middles. There was no honey, no herbs, nothing but grain and salt and water. Yet when Demeter broke open the first loaf, steam curling into the air, the women crowded close, savoring the warmth. "Bread is never just bread," Demeter reminded them, her eyes soft. "It is the promise of another day. It is the patience of your own hands, the strength of your fields, the kindness you show one another." After the lesson, the goddess left as quietly as she had come, vanishing into the shifting gold of the wheat fields. But her words lingered in the air, settling over the city like a gentle blessing. The women returned to their work, their movements slower, more thoughtful. Even the children noticed that the bread tasted different. No sweeter, no softer, but somehow more comforting, more real. You might think such a day would go unnoticed in the grand history of Athens. There were no feasts, no miracles, only the daily work of feeding a city. Yet for those who baked, who waited, who learned to find meaning in the slow rise of dough, that lesson would become a quiet foundation, enduring, ordinary, and essential. As dusk settled over Athens, the smell of baking bread drifted through the streets, a soft reminder that even the most boring traditions are woven with quiet care. And as Demeter walked the fields beneath a sky slowly deepening to blue, she wondered, perhaps as you do now, is it the bread itself that nourishes us, or the patience and love it takes to make it, day after day? If you've ever stood in a warm kitchen at dawn, hands dusted with flour, you know the simple comfort of repetition. The next morning in Athens began much like the last, the city stirring in gentle waves, smoke curling from chimneys, the low hum of voices as bakers and mothers greeted another day. Yet in the small households where Demeter had spent her time, something had shifted, a subtle change, quieter than song or prayer. The women gathered again around the communal oven, their motions a little slower, a little more thoughtful. Demeter's lesson echoed in their minds. You cannot rush the earth. Let it rise in its own time. As they kneaded the dough, they paused to listen for the soft sigh of fermentation, the faint crackle of crust forming in the heat. Children watched, curious, tracing patterns in spilled flour on the stone floor. Bread making was not glamorous work. The ingredients were humble: rough wheat, a pinch of salt, water drawn from the city well. There were no festivals, no feasts, just the daily rhythm of patience, mixing, waiting, shaping, baking. But within that routine, Demeter's wisdom found its way into the very hands and hearts of Athens. One young woman, Marine, noticed the difference most. She was new to the city, her family having come from a rocky hillside far from the agora. At first, her bread was dense and sour, her fingers clumsy, her confidence as brittle as stale crust. But under Demeter's patient guidance, she learned to wait, not just for the dough, but for herself. She learned the quiet satisfaction of shaping loaves in the early morning light, the pride in a golden crust, the kindness of sharing her bread with neighbors who had little. You will see, Demeter had promised, that bread made with patience will feed more than your body. Marine came to understand those words, not as magic, but as the steady truth of daily living. When she baked with care, she found she had more to share. When she slowed her hands, her mind followed, and the small anxieties of city life melted into the rhythm of kneading and waiting. Across Athens, the lesson rippled outward. Men in the fields paused to chew on rough slices of bread, remembering the goddess's advice to rest between labors. Elderly women at the market passed on tips: how to judge the heat of a fire, when to let a loaf cool, why a meal eaten together always tasted better than one eaten alone. Even the children, at first impatient for treats, grew used to waiting, learning that good things, bread and otherwise, took time. Demeter herself returned often, though not always in form that mortals recognized. Sometimes she was an old woman offering advice at the well, sometimes a farmer, quietly praising a well-turned furrow. She watched as the city's rhythm changed, slowly, imperceptibly, but for the better. She saw laughter shared over fresh bread, disputes softened by a shared meal, families brought together at dusk around simple, sustaining food. It was not dramatic, not the stuff of epic poetry or marble monuments, but in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world was still and the only sound was the gentle cracking of crusts in cooling ovens, Athens was learning what Demeter already knew: that true sustenance lies not just in what we eat, but in the patience and community that give meaning to the meal. One evening, as the shadows grew long and the ovens cooled, Myrrhine sat beside her grandmother, watching the stars. She broke a loaf between them, the crust still warm, and shared the last words Demeter had spoken. Bread is the promise of another day. Her grandmother smiled, pressing her hand. And the patience to make it is a promise to yourself. You, too, may have felt it, the way the smallest rituals shape the longest days, how patience and care leave their mark on even the humblest task. As the night deepened over Athens and the city settled into a quiet peace, Demeter wandered through the fields, listening to the contented sighs drifting up from the hearths. She wondered, perhaps as you do now, is the true gift of tradition the bread itself, or the quiet strength we gain when we learn to wait, work, and share together day after day? If you return in your imagination to ancient Athens at dusk, you might find the city unchanged on the surface. The streets still wind their way through hills and olive groves. Children still call to one another as the light fades. Bakers and farmers finish their work, dusted with flour and tired in their bones. But beneath this ordinariness, something subtle has taken root. A new patience, a deeper sense of care, passed quietly from hand to hand. In the months following Demeter's lesson, Athens grew more attentive to its bread. The communal ovens became places not just of baking but of gathering, where news was shared, arguments softened, and laughter echoed against warm stone walls. Neighbors who once hurried past one another now paused to compare loaves, offer advice, or share a crust with a child. Patience, learned in the rhythm of bread-making, seeped into other parts of life, in how disputes were settled, in how the sick were nursed, even in how seeds were planted and fields allowed to rest. Demeter, ever watchful, took comfort in these small changes. She saw Myrrhine teach her younger siblings the careful folding of dough, heard old women remind their sons not to rush the grain harvest, watched men return from the fields and stop to greet their neighbors before hurrying home. The lesson she had hoped to share, that sustenance comes not only from the earth but from the time and care we devote to each other, had woven itself quietly into the city's fabric. For Demeter, these quiet triumphs mattered more than any grand altar or festival. She wandered the city in many shapes, as a market vendor offering encouragement, as a grandmother passing a loaf across the table, as a silent presence at the edge of a field. She did not seek thanks. The patience of bread-making, after all, was its own reward. On a bright morning near the end of the harvest, Athens gathered for the Thesmophoria, Demeter's own festival. The women brought their best loaves to the central square, not golden, or sweet but dense, plain and honest, bearing the marks of many patient hands. They laid the bread on woven cloths, a humble offering to the goddess who had taught them to slow down, to listen, to wait. There was no spectacle, no miracles, just a sense of peace, of tasks done well and days lived fully. The city ate together that night, breaking bread beneath the autumn sky, feeling a quiet pride in what they had learned and shared. Demeter, watching from the edge of the crowd, felt a gentle satisfaction. She knew that her gift would endure long after the festival ended, carried on in kitchens and fields in the patient hearts of those who remembered her lesson. As the festival faded and the people drifted home, the goddess wandered back into the fields. The moonlight touched the golden wheat, the air rich with the scent of earth and cooling bread. Demeter lingered a while, listening to the steady rhythm of the world she had helped shape. One loaf, one lesson, one day at a time. And perhaps you too can feel it. The quiet power of routines that ground us. The patient kindness that feeds, more than hunger. As the stars brightened over Athens and sleep settled over its people, Demeter considered a final question, gentle as the promise of dawn. Is it the simplest acts, done patiently and with care, that feed the spirit of a city, and teach us again and again what it truly means to be nourished? If you've ever planned your day around one simple, reliable tool, a favorite pen, a trusted pair of shoes, an old garden spade, you'll know the quiet shock when it fails you. Even Artemis, goddess of the hunt, was not immune to such disruptions. Though she was famed for her wild freedom, for the certainty of her bow and the swift silence of her arrows, Artemis began one ordinary morning in a way that felt both familiar and unexpectedly frustrating. With a broken arrow, the forest at dawn was her domain, cool, silver-lit, brimming with dew. Artemis moved through it as if it were an extension of herself, feet quiet on moss, eyes keen for every shadow and movement. Her bow was strung and ready, a smooth, comforting weight in her hand. Her quiver, as always, was filled with arrows. She had crafted herself, each one shaped to her careful specifications. These arrows were not works of art, but tools, functional, consistent, and steady, just as she liked things to be. But this morning, as Artemis paused to draw an arrow for the day's first hunt, she felt a faint give beneath her fingers. The shaft, usually firm and straight, bent and the fletching came loose. She frowned, rolling the arrow in her palm, inspecting the crack that ran down its length. The arrow, it seemed, had splintered in the night. It was such a small flaw, almost invisible. But in Artemis's world, where certainty mattered, even the tiniest failure felt like a shift in the earth. She tried to brush it aside, choosing another arrow from the quiver, but now a seed of doubt had been sown. Was the whole batch faulty? Had she rushed her crafting, or grown careless with maintenance? She ran her thumb over each shaft, testing for weakness. Several were fine, but one or two more showed signs of wear. The day ahead, once planned with the quiet confidence of routine, now seemed unsettled. Artemis could still hunt, of course. She could make do. Yet her mind wandered to the source of the problem, to memories of late nights fletching arrows by firelight, to promises she'd made to herself about always being prepared. Frustration flickered in her chest, subtle but real. Even the goddess of wild things was not immune to ordinary disappointments. She wandered deeper into the woods, bow in hand, senses heightened not for prey, but for the gentle cracks and creaks of her own uncertainty. She remembered her earliest lessons, how her father Zeus taught her to check every tool before setting out, how her mother Leto reminded her that even a goddess learns best from what goes wrong. Artemis stopped, at a quiet stream, kneeling beside the water's edge. She examined the broken arrow again, watching sunlight catch on the splintered wood. She felt a pang, not just of annoyance, but of humility. There was comfort in the routine, in knowing each tool would perform as expected. But when something failed, it forced her to slow down, to reconsider her process, to pay attention in ways she hadn't in a long while. She decided not to hunt that morning. Instead, she gathered reeds and branches, searching for the right shape and strength. She sat on a mossy stone, letting the quiet of the forest settle around her, and began to craft new arrows. Her movements were methodical, patient. Each step, stripping bark, smoothing shafts, tying feathers, was a gentle act of restoration, of returning to basics. Birds sang in the trees above. The stream gurgled steadily at her feet. As she worked, Artemis thought of the many times she'd hurried through her routines, trusting old skills to carry her. She realized how easy it was to take reliability for granted, to assume the tools we depend on will always be there, always strong. Yet even gods, she saw now, must sometimes start. Over by midday, Artemis had a fresh bundle of arrows, straighter and sturdier than before. Her hands were sore, but her mind was calm, grounded by the simple tasks. She felt a quiet pride in the work, not for the perfection of the arrows, but for the patience it took to remake them. When she finally rose to resume her hunt, Artemis paused, looking at the broken arrow one last time. She did not toss it away. Instead, she tucked it into her quiver as a reminder that even the smallest failures can bring us back to ourselves, teaching us to move more slowly, to notice, to begin again. As evening fell, she returned to camp. Her day changed not by grand adventure, but by a gentle lesson in humility and care. The forest, unchanged, seemed somehow more welcoming, more alive to the rhythms of making and remaking. And perhaps you too have known such days. A simple setback, a pause for patience, a quiet lesson learned beside running water and birdsong. As Artemis settled by her fire, listening to the world breathe, she asked herself, and you, a question as soft as twilight. Is it the flawless arrow, or the willingness to repair what breaks, that keeps us steady in a world always shifting beneath our feet? When the morning after a setback arrives, the world looks much the same, yet something inside you has changed. Artemis woke early, the forest shrouded in mist, dew beating on every leaf and spiderweb. She moved quietly through her camp, mindful of the small aches in her hands from yesterday's work, the faint memory of frustration now softened into a calm resolve. She started her day not with the hunt, but with simple, careful maintenance, inspecting her tools, checking the bindings of her sandals, tending to her bow. Each action felt purposeful, almost meditative, a way of reassuring herself that order could be restored, one patient gesture at a time. The broken arrow, now repaired as best as she could manage, lay beside her new ones. Artemis studied it in the cool light, running her thumb along the old crack, the fresh binding. It would never be perfect again, but it was still useful. A reminder of how flaws, when tended with care, could become quiet teachers. As the sun rose higher, Artemis set out into the forest. Her pace was slower than usual, her senses tuned not just to movement and sound, but to the feel of the earth beneath her feet, the texture of bark beneath her fingers. The forest seemed to invite this slowness. Birds hopped from branch to branch, a fox paused to watch her pass, the world breathing in gentle, steady rhythms. You might imagine that the goddess of the hunt would be restless, eager for action, but Artemis felt no urgency today. She followed a deer trail for a while, then paused at a fallen log, observing the patterns of moss and the slow passage of ants. She realized with a touch of amusement that her broken arrow had made her more attentive to small things, to changes in the world, to her own moods and habits. Later that morning, Artemis encountered a group of her companions, young nymphs, full of laughter and energy, darting through the undergrowth with bows and makeshift arrows. They stopped when they saw her, gathering around, eyes bright with curiosity. "Did you catch anything today?" one asked, glancing at Artemis's quiver. "Not yet," Artemis replied, her tone warm but even. "Today I'm hunting patience, not game." The nymphs giggled, unsure if she was joking, but Artemis smiled and invited them to sit with her beside the stream. She showed them the broken arrow, explaining how even the best tools need care, and how sometimes starting over brings a better result than rushing to fix a mistake. The nymphs listened, fidgeting a little, then eagerly helped gather materials for new arrows, straight reeds, sturdy feathers, sharp stones. Together they crafted a handful of serviceable arrows, working, slowly, learning to pay attention to each step. The work was imperfect, sometimes clumsy, but full of encouragement and shared purpose. As they finished, Artemis noticed how the nymphs began to handle their tools with more respect, checking for splinters, retying loose fletchings, asking questions about wood and weight. The lesson had taken root, not through speeches or commands, but through quiet example and gentle repetition. The day drifted on, peaceful and unhurried. Artemis found contentment not in a successful hunt, but in the steady rhythm of making, teaching, and observing. She realized that the pause forced by her broken arrow had opened space for reflection, for learning, for a deeper connection with her companions and the forest itself. In the cool of the evening, Artemis and the nymphs gathered around a small fire. They shared stories of hunts gone wrong, of tools repaired and reused, of the pride that comes from work done patiently and well. The broken arrow, now honored as a lesson, lay at the center of the circle, a symbol of humility and growth. As the stars brightened above the treetops, Artemis felt a gentle gratitude for setbacks that slow us down, for the wisdom hidden in daily care, for the small joys found in beginning again. She looked at her companions, their faces soft in the firelight, and wondered, as perhaps you do now, do we learn more from what works as expected, or from the quiet repairs and shared efforts that follow when things go wrong? If you have ever found comfort in mending something that was broken, you may understand how Artemis felt as another day unfolded. There was a steadiness in her movements now, a restored confidence not born of flawlessness, but of patience and the willingness to begin again. The morning after her lesson with the nymphs, Artemis rose with the sun. The forest, bathed in soft gold, felt especially welcoming, a patchwork of shadow and light, familiar paths stretching before her. She checked her bow and arrows with careful hands, noting the small imperfections that made each tool unique. The broken arrow, repaired, marked by its binding, rested among the new ones, no longer a source of frustration, but a quiet reminder of growth. This time, Artemis allowed herself to move at her natural pace, letting the day unfold without rush. Her mind was clearer, more open to the subtle rhythms of the world around her. She hunted, yes, but without the urgency of proving her skill. Instead, she tracked quietly, noticing the tracks of deer in soft mud, the rustle of a lizard through ferns, the distant call of a hawk. Her focus had deepened, not because everything was perfect, but because she had learned to attend to what needed care, one small moment at a time. When she finally loosed an arrow, a new one, crafted in the company of her friends, it flew straight and true, landing softly in the underbrush. Artemis retrieved it, feeling a gentle satisfaction. The hunt was successful, but more than that, she felt contentment in the process itself. The slow preparation, the mindful attention, the shared knowledge. Later, Artemis gathered with the nymphs again, this time not to teach, but simply to be together. They shared a simple meal by the fire, talking quietly about their day. The broken arrow sat between them, a small token of their efforts and the gentle patience that had guided their hands. As dusk settled, Artemis reflected on how easily she had once taken her own skill for granted. The broken arrow had unsettled her, yes, but it had also nudged her back toward humility, toward community, toward an appreciation of each step in the journey. She realized that certainty was not always in having the perfect tool, but in the trust that when things break, she, and those around her, could make them whole again. When night finally wrapped the forest in stillness, Artemis tucked the arrow into her quiver one last time. She knew she would keep it, not as a sign of failure, but as a symbol of patience and quiet perseverance. The forest, unchanged in its beauty, now felt more like home than ever. As you drift toward sleep, you might carry with you the question Artemis left herself, sitting by the embers. Is it strength that keeps us moving forward, or the gentle willingness to slow down, to repair, and to begin again, no matter how small the break? If you've ever been asked to count every item in a cupboard or track every plant in a crowded garden, you know the peculiar fatigue of keeping tally. A slow work, repetitive, and rarely celebrated but necessary for order. On one especially warm afternoon, even Dionysus, the god of wine and revelry, found himself at the mercy of such a task. The annual grape census. Dionysus was best known for his laughter, for wild festivals, for the freedom of his vine-strewn groves. His followers sang late into the night. His name was a promise of abundance, of pleasure, of escape from the tedium of daily life. Yet what few remembered was that behind every overflowing cup, every song and dance, there lay the patient work of the vineyard, the tending, the training, the endless counting of what the earth provided. The grape census was not a festival. It was an obligation, dull, methodical, performed every summer just before harvest. Dionysus would walk the rows of vines, tallying each cluster, counting berries, noting their color and ripeness. The satyrs and nymphs grumbled at the chore, their spirits dulled by the monotony. There were no drums, no laughter, just the steady scratching of stylus on wax tablet and the droning chorus of numbers rising and falling in the heat. That afternoon, the sun hung low and golden, baking the earth, making the leaves shimmer and wilt. Dionysus, hair bound back and sleeves rolled high, moved from row to row, stylus in hand, brow furrowed with concentration. He felt the sweat gathering under his tunic, the rough bite of dust at his ankles. For every cluster he counted, another seemed to spring up, hidden in shade or tangled behind a twisting branch. He paused, wiping his brow, and surveyed the endless sea of green. The task seemed impossible, an entire season's promise, reduced to a list of numbers. Dionysus loved the chaos of plenty, the riot of harvest, the joy of surprise. But this work was about limits, about slow accumulation, about the patient, careful management that would ensure wine for the year to come. The nymphs joined him, grumbling softly, their enthusiasm faded by the monotony. One muttered as she tried to count clusters in the highest vines. "I thought the god of wine would have more exciting jobs than this." Dionysus only smiled, half amused, half resigned. "Even the wildest vines need pruning," he said quietly. "And abundance means nothing if we cannot measure what we have." The hours passed, marked by the rhythmic sound of counting and the quiet scratching of notes. The vineyard, usually alive with song and mischief, was hushed and drowsy. Dionysus found his mind drifting as he worked, remembering other years, other harvests, times when he had tried to avoid this duty and paid for it with spoiled wine or unexpected shortages. He realized, as he moved along the rows, how much his followers depended on the simple order of this counting. The nymphs needed to know which barrels would be filled, the satyrs how many feasts they could plan, the mortals how many jars would be carried to market. Every wild celebration rested on the quiet labor of keeping track. By late afternoon, the sun dipped lower and shadows stretched long between the vines. Dionysus felt the ache in his shoulders, the slight tedium that made each number blur into the next. Still, he pressed on, knowing that the work, however dull, was a promise to the future. In the careful listing of grapes, there was hope for another season, another harvest, another joy. As dusk settled and the counting drew to a close, Dionysus gathered the nymphs and satyrs under a fig tree. They slumped with relief, dust on their faces and purple stains on their hands. Dionysus thanked them, his words gentle and sincere. "Without this," he said, holding up his wax tablet, "there would be no wine, no laughter, no music when the days grow cold." They nodded, quietly proud despite the boredom, and shared bread and cool water as the first stars brightened above the vineyard. Dionysus looked at the rows of counted grapes, feeling the deep satisfaction that came not from revelry, but from slow, steady labor. And perhaps you too know this feeling. The quiet peace after a dull task is finally finished, the comfort of order beneath the surface of abundance. As Dionysus leaned back against the tree, eyes closing in the cool air, he wondered, gently, sincerely, is celebration truly wild and free? Or is it only possible because of the slow, boring work that lets us count our blessings, one grape at a time? Morning in the vineyard was gentle, the world washed fresh by a hint of dew. After the previous day's long hours of counting, Dionysus rose slowly, stretching sore muscles, the ache of monotony lingering faintly in his arms. The census was not finished. The clusters counted yesterday would have to be checked again, compared with notes from years past, the tiniest changes recorded for future feasts and harvests. He wandered between the rows, stylus in hand, his steps more deliberate now. It was easy in the quiet of early morning to forget the wildness that was supposed to define his days. Yet Dionysus felt a subtle pride in the simple order of his lists. the way each tally was a small promise, each line a quiet thread connecting the abundance of now to the security of seasons yet to come. The nymphs joined him in the field, voices low, moving with the languor that comes after too much sun and too many numbers. They gathered in pairs and trios, sharing the work, calling out the ripest clusters, debating whether a single withered berry should count toward the final total. Satyrs appeared as well, less enthusiastic but no less diligent, their jokes muted, their minds turned to the prospect of full jars and sweet wine. Dionysus watched them, noting the way their laughter returned in fits and starts. A joke here, a song hummed under the breath there. The census, though tedious, was becoming its own kind of ritual, a time for quiet camaraderie and the slow weaving together of a community sustained by routine. Even boredom, he realized, was softer in good company. They broke for a simple meal beneath the shade of an ancient olive tree. The food was plain: bread, olives, a handful of figs, and conversation was soft, the kind of talk that fills the spaces left by hard work. One nymph told a story about the first vineyard, when the grapes were so wild, no one could ever count them all. A satyr mused that if the numbers grew too large, maybe Dionysus would just declare every jar bottomless and be done with it. Dionysus smiled at their teasing. "Counting reminds us that what we have is real," he said quietly, picking a cluster from the vine and turning it in his hands. "It keeps the feasts honest, the wine true, and the laughter long." They all nodded, understanding in their own way. After the meal, the group returned to their work. They checked the farthest vines, counted baskets of fallen grapes, compared notes scribbled on wrinkled scraps of parchment. The work grew slower as the day wore on, but there was a strange comfort in the repetition. The sun, high and hot, forced them to pause often, to rest and share stories, to help one another when eyes grew weary and numbers blurred together. Dionysus moved among his friends, not as a distant god, but as a patient companion, offering a drink of water, a word of encouragement, a hand with a stubborn knot of vines. By mid-afternoon, the census was nearly complete. The nymphs and satyrs found themselves quietly proud of their diligence, their jokes returning as the work finally neared its end. As evening fell and the vineyard glowed in golden light, Dionysus gathered everyone together. The wax tablets were stacked, the numbers carefully checked and double-checked. He thanked them, not with a grand speech, but with a simple nod, a warm smile, and a promise. Because of this work, the festival will be abundant. The wine will flow all winter, and we will have enough for every song, every story, every friend. They celebrated the finished task not with revelry, but with a long, contented sigh, the sense of a job well done settling over the vineyard like the first cool breeze of night. And as Dionysus sat in the gathering dusk, surrounded by friends, and the sweet scent of ripening grapes, he asked himself, and you, a gentle question. Is happiness found only in wild celebration, or also in the long, patient hours of preparation and care, when we count our gifts, one by one, with those who matter most? If you listen to the vineyard on the evening after the census, you'll hear a different music than the wild songs Dionysus was famous for. There's the rustle of leaves as the breeze cools the day's heat, the slow footsteps of tired workers returning home, and the low murmur of conversation that comes when people have shared honest work. Dionysus remained a little while longer among the vines, watching the sky deepen from gold to indigo. The tally tablets lay stacked beside him, every number checked and rechecked, the results already shaping plans for winter wine, for autumn feasts, for gifts to friends and strangers alike. He found a gentle pride in those rows of numbers, the proof, quiet but enduring, that even joy is built on foundations of patience. He thought of other years, when he had left the census to chance, when grapes were left to rot, or barrels ran empty before spring. How much celebration, he realized, is only possible when someone takes the time to count, to care, to prepare for days ahead. The nymphs and satyrs gathered again under the old fig tree, their voices low but warm. Someone began a slow, contented song, not of revelry but of gratitude, for shade and harvest, for good company and enough bread, for the surety that comes when abundance is tended, not taken for granted. They shared a little of the last season's wine, not in raucous toasts, but in quiet sips, savoring the taste made possible by their own diligence. Dionysus looked at them, at the grape-stained fingers, the tired faces lit with satisfaction, and saw not boredom, but a kind of peace. He realized that even for a god of wild things, there was a lesson in the calm and order of the census, the steady security that made true celebration possible, the sense of belonging that came from doing something needed, even when no one was watching. He rose at last, wandering the rows one final time, the ground cool under his bare feet. The vines seemed to hum with the promise of harvest, the clusters heavy and real in the fading light. Dionysus felt a gentle gratitude for the patience of his friends, for the rhythms of seasons, for the knowledge that even gods must pause sometimes, must take account, must learn the quiet art of enough. As night fell and the stars appeared, Dionysus made his way home, leaving the vineyard at peace. He knew that the next festival would come soon, with all its laughter and song. But tonight, it was enough to rest among the quiet plenty, to trust that what had been counted and cared for would see them through. And as sleep settled over the vineyard, Dionysus asked himself, and you, a final question. Isn't every joyful feast, every moment of abundance, rooted in these small, boring tasks, the counting, the waiting, the care that turns the chaos of the world into something lasting and sweet? If you've ever faced a long list of chores after returning from a trip, sorting through mail, checking supplies, making sure everything is as it should be, you'll understand something of Persephone's life when she returned each year to the underworld. The stories of her abduction and the turning of the seasons were well known, told in whispers and song across Greece. But few remembered that, after the fanfare, Persephone was faced with her own particular duty, the annual inventory. The underworld was a vast place, deep echoing and full of quiet, necessary order. While Hades ruled its boundaries and judges passed their sentences, it was Persephone who kept things running smoothly. Each autumn, after her return from the world above, she walked its endless halls, wax tablet in hand, checking and counting, making sure nothing was lost or neglected in her absence. It was not a glamorous task. Persephone's ledger was a plain, heavy thing, filled with columns and careful notations. She tallied everything: the torches that lit the passageways, the number of cups and bowls in the great hall, the offerings left by mortals, pomegranates, honey, sprigs of rosemary. There were lists for everything: blankets for the newly arrived, oil for the lamps, fresh reeds for the riverbank. She began her work on the very first morning back, her footsteps echoing softly along the polished stone floors. The air was cool and still. Shades drifted past, murmuring to themselves or gathering in the quiet corners of their afterlife. Some nodded to Persephone, recognizing her gentle authority, while others hardly seemed to notice her at all. The first task was always the same: checking the stores. Persephone moved through the great storerooms, counting sacks of barley, amphorae of oil, baskets of dried figs. She made careful marks on her tablet, pausing now and then to adjust a crooked stack or wipe away a film of dust. Every item had its place. Every shelf told a story of last year's choices, of what had lasted and what had spoiled, of what needed restocking and what could be given away. Hades would sometimes join her, curious but out of place among the ledgers and tallies. "You're more thorough than any mortal accountant," he teased one morning, leaning against a cold marble column. Persephone only smiled, her focus unwavering. "Order makes this world bearable, for the living and the dead," she replied, softly. "Without it, even abundance turns to waste." There was comfort in the routine, in knowing that nothing would be missed. Persephone found a strange satisfaction in these ordinary tasks. She felt the rhythms of the underworld in her bones, the soft flutter of a shade's robe, the hush of river water against the shore, the steady tick of time marked not by seasons, but by checklists and ledgers. But not every task was easy. Sometimes she found items missing: an amphora of wine that had spoiled in the dark, a ceremonial cup cracked and unusable. Sometimes she discovered things left undone, repairs needed, new arrivals who had not yet been properly welcomed. Each error tugged at her, a gentle reminder that no system was perfect and that even in the land of the dead, there was always work to be done. The routine went on for days, slow and careful. Persephone visited the riverbank to make sure the reeds were growing well, spoke with the shades assigned to tend the lamps, listened to the quiet complaints of those who wanted more comfort or fewer rules. She was not harsh, but she was firm. Every item counted, every voice heard, every duty given its due. At the end of each day, Persephone sat in her quiet chamber, reviewing her notes, her mind humming with the details of another year's cycle. She wondered, as she tallied the last line, how much of her power was found in these boring, necessary labors, how much comfort she brought simply by keeping the world in order. And perhaps you have known this too, the peace that follows a job done patiently, the quiet sense of control that comes from knowing what is in your care. As Persephone closed her ledger for the night, she allowed herself a single open-ended thought. Is it in the grand gestures or the small acts of counting, checking, and steady care that we keep even the darkest places livable, year after year, season after season? If you picture Persephone, moving softly through the shadowed corridors of the underworld, you'll notice how little escapes her attention. Each day's inventory became a meditation, a practice in seeing not only what was there, but what was missing, what had changed, and what needed gentle repair. The second week of Persephone's routine brought its own challenges, minor shortages, mislaid keys, a shipment of olives that had gone sour in the damp. She found herself consulting with caretakers, making quiet arrangements for repairs, issuing instructions with patient clarity. Every problem was met with calm, her voice steady as a river in winter. You might expect a queen to delegate, to rule from a distance, but Persephone's authority came from her presence. She preferred to see for herself, to count the jars, to taste the oil, to walk the long halls by lamplight and listen to the everyday murmurs of her realm. The shades she encountered grew used to her questions. Some offered small complaints: blankets too thin, a lamp smoking in the drafty corridor, too much noise near the entrance where the newly arrived gathered to reminisce about mortal life. Persephone took every comment seriously, jotting notes in the margin of her ledger. At the end of each round, she gathered the stewards for a quiet meeting in the main hall. The circle was plain: old benches, plain cups of water, the soft glow of lanterns, swinging overhead. Together they reviewed the lists, made small plans, shared quiet laughter over the most unexpected problems, a batch of reeds nibbled by river mice, a shade convinced that more honey would solve every difficulty. These were not matters for epic poetry, but for Persephone they were at the heart of what made the underworld bearable. There was comfort in order, in knowing that every soul could expect a certain kindness, a blanket, a warm lamp, a regular meal. It was the kind of comfort often overlooked by those who only told stories of abductions and thunderous returns. Sometimes Persephone was tempted to do less, to let things drift, to skip a hallway, to trust that the little matters would sort themselves out. But she knew how quickly small problems became large ones in a place without sun, how neglect could echo through the halls, leaving restlessness and quiet despair. She moved slowly but steadily, her patience a kind of strength. There were moments of weariness, of course. One evening, after a long round of checking storerooms, Persephone lingered by the Lethe River, the surface black and still. She watched the shades pass by, some lost in memory, others simply drifting. The endlessness of the work pressed on her for a moment, a feeling of being responsible for more than one person could ever manage. Yet even as the weight threatened to grow heavy, Persephone found reassurance in her own rituals. She walked back to the great hall, lit the last of the lamps and made her nightly notes by the soft golden glow. She allowed herself a quiet cup of pomegranate tea and a few minutes to rest before sleep, listening to the gentle hush of the world below. Sometimes Hades would join her in these late hours, offering a rare word of praise or a simple story from the world above. Persephone cherished these moments, brief respites from duty, reminders that even in the land of shadows, connection and care were possible. As another inventory day ended, Persephone reviewed her lists, lines crossed out, margins filled with reminders, columns ticking steadily toward completion. She closed her ledger and looked around her chamber, feeling a gentle pride not for the grandeur of her kingdom, but for the quiet order she brought to it, year after year. And perhaps you too have known this satisfaction, the peace of setting things right, the assurance that even in darkness, steady care and attention can make a place feel almost like home. As Persephone turned down her lamp and settled into sleep, she wondered, is it through patience with small, repetitive tasks that we truly shape our world, turning even the loneliest places into spaces of comfort and quiet hope? When the final day of the inventory arrived, Persephone felt a calm anticipation. The long rows of numbers, the lists of blankets and oil, of cups and reeds and honey, all came together into a quiet assurance. The underworld, for another year, was in good order. She walked the corridors one last time, checking the lamps, making sure the riverbank was tidy, and that the storehouses were full enough for the months ahead. She met with her stewards in the central hall, voices low as they reviewed each last item, confirming that nothing had been forgotten, that every shade had what they needed to find comfort in their endless days below. It was a satisfaction unlike any other. Persephone knew the tales sung about her, of her abduction, of the turning of the seasons, of her power over life and death. But it was this steady work, this invisible labor of care, that grounded her. She found a gentle pride in knowing that, while the world above changed with every spring and winter, here in the underworld there was a place for patience, for kindness, for simple sufficiency. As she sat in her chamber, the final inventory closed. Persephone poured herself a cup of sweet, warm wine and reflected on another year's effort. She knew the work would never be finished. There would always be new arrivals, new shortages, small things lost or broken that needed her attention. Yet the cycle itself became a source of peace, the comfort of repetition, the meaning made from care. That evening, Hades joined her for a quiet meal. They talked about old times and new tasks, sharing bread and stories, the room lit by a single lamp Persephone had just trimmed. He thanked her for her diligence, for the peace she brought, to a place so often misunderstood. Persephone accepted his gratitude with a small smile, content not with applause but with the deep calm of a world in balance. She watched as the last lamps flickered gently in the corridors and thought of the shades settling into their rest. Blankets pulled close, the darkness softened by her steady hand. Persephone knew she would soon walk the world above again, face the sharp brightness and bustle of living things. But here, for now, she had created a refuge, a place where even the restless dead could find a measure of comfort. As sleep began to gather at the edges of her mind, Persephone considered one last question, one she sends to you as you settle in for rest. Isn't it the ordinary patient acts of care, the counting, the mending, the listening, that quietly hold the world together, giving us peace even in places touched by shadow?